All right, fine people of YouTube, welcome back to part 4, if I'm not mistaken, of the building a Rick and Morty app in iOS and Swift. In the last video, we set up the models for our project, i.e. all of these. One thing that I forgot to do, which I'm going to do right now, is stage and commit our work. So we're going to open up Terminal. We're going to cd into our project folder. We'll stage everything, and we are going to commit. And I'm going to go ahead and say add models, and we're going to also go ahead and push this. Now, before we jump into the meat of this video, make sure you drop a like down below, hit subscribe if you're new here, comment for that YouTube algorithm, and let's dive in. So what are we going to do today? So we are going to attempt, we'll see how long it takes, to set up our actual API, make some calls, and get some data back. So let's see how long this takes us. Maybe we'll split it into 2 videos. Let's start by jumping into our API request object, aka a RM request. So the way that we plan to do this is any call site that wants to make a request to the API should create one of these request objects. And via the request object, we should just be able to pass it to the service and get basically our response back. So we could structure this in a variety of ways. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is as follows. So we are going to have this request object here, which we have already. If we think about it, what do we need to know on this request object? I'm just going to add some comments here. So we're going to want to know a base URL. We're going to want to know the endpoints that we're trying to reach. And let me actually copy one of these URLs here as an example. So this one here that I've got open, I'm going to jump into characters, and we're going to say maybe get a single character. And these are all get methods, if I'm not mistaken, which is the RESTful method type we're going to use. But let me just paste in this URL. So we can see here that we have our base URL, we have the endpoint, and in some cases we also have an additional path. So maybe we're going to have something called path components. And let's see what other API types exist. So there is an option to filter locations. And let's see, so it looks like we can go ahead and specify these parameters. And let's see, so if you want to know how to use queries, check here. So we're going to click into here, and it looks like this goes to character, and then we can also specify these get parameters. We say name is Rick, the status is alive, and this will specifically return to us the character that matches this filter. So these are basically what we call query parameters. So we're going to also have query parameters, and these are kind of going to be optional, right? So we might have them sometimes, and sometimes we might not. So let's go ahead and attempt to model this. Now there's one thing that we are actually missing, and what that is we need a way to tell our actual service when we get a response by executing the request. In the callback, in the completion handler, we're going to return a result, but what is the type of the object that we should actually return? So we're going to return an error if something fails and goes wrong. But in this case, I just stuck a string in here. How do we know what the type of this is going to be? And there is a variety of ways we can do this. We can use generics. We can use generics inside of this request object, or we can actually use the any keyword, which will drop type safety from this. So we're going to use generics. Now, I know it's a scary word and a lot of people get confused by them, so we're going to work through it together. But before we get ahead of ourselves, and by ourselves I mean myself, let's go ahead and actually build this out. So let's actually include all this. So we already know what the base URL is. It's basically this thing here up until API. So we're going to create here a private struct called constants. And here I'm going to toss in a static let base URL. And if you can hear the background noise, it's just insanely windy outside, so ignore that. So we are also going to have a endpoint. Now, if you guys recall, we did create a RM endpoint enum, so that's pretty great. We can have the caller pass this in, so we can say the endpoint will be an RM endpoint. All right, pretty cool. So we can get rid of that. Path component is basically optional, and Either we can go ahead and create this as a string, or we can actually define a collection of path components if we want to define them. So I'm going to actually define them, and we might have to read through the API to find all of them. So let's go ahead and do that. So we are going to, well, I digress actually. Instead of defining them, let's make our life easy. And I'm just going to make them an array of strings for now. And this way, if we have it, we can specify it. If not, we can always come back and clean it up. So there is our path, and then we have query parameters. And let's go ahead and say let query parameters, and I believe there's an object type called URL query item. And if we click into this from the standard library, we actually already have a name and a value. And this is very similar to what this is here. So name would be the name and the value would be Rick in this particular case. Now we have an error up here because we haven't specified a constructor for this class. So let's go ahead and do that right now. So I'm gonna go ahead and delete this comment, and let's create a constructor. So it'll be a public class, and actually the new Xcode 14 does a really good job of auto-completing everything for us here. So it'll go ahead and say endpoint. Looks like it actually missed some of them. Let's try that again. So we're gonna say init, and looks like it only is bringing in the endpoint here. So we'll stick in the other ones manually. So we do want to also bring in path components. And as you recall, I mentioned that these can in fact be just empty. So instead of making it nullable, I'll just default it to a empty array. Similar with query parameters here, we may or may not have them on the URL. So I will go ahead and do that here. And just like we have done for the endpoint, I'm gonna assign the path components and the query items. So cool, so now that we've got this stuff inside of here, it'd be probably pretty nice if we can actually construct a API URL. In other words, like a fully qualified URL given all this information that we have. So what I'm gonna go ahead and do is create a computed property for that, right? But I'm also gonna privatize all this because we don't wanna expose this to the outside world. Rather, what we want to do is via a public computed property, we're going to go ahead and create and return a optional URL. The reason it's going to be optional is because the URL constructor is indeed failable. So we do want to account for that. I'm going to publicize these. I'm going to start adding some comments here as well to keep our code nice and documented. So what we're going to do here is we are going to construct a string, and what I'll do here is say private var URL string, and inside of here we're gonna put together all the pieces and make the string. So we know that our string here will start off as the base URL, and after we've got the base URL, what we want to do is we're gonna say string, go ahead and append a slash. What we're going to do after that is append the endpoint.raw value. So at this point, we have our raw value. We then want to return the string at the bottom here, and we want to take care of the path component and query parameters. But we do want to check if they are not empty. So if this isn't empty, we can go ahead and say so first of all, if they're not empty, to the end of the particular URL, the endpoint that we have thus far, we do want to add a slash. And then what we want to go ahead and do is say or we can actually just do path components dot for each. And in here, we're going to do the same thing more or less. We're going to say plus equals slash and then $0, which will represent the particular path component. And actually we can drop this. So if our path component has, let's say, like 20 elements inside of it, it'll loop over all of them. It'll put a trailing slash, and that way we'll have a appropriately set up URL. Now, similarly, we can copy and paste this and say if we have query parameters, we are going to loop over them as well. And what we can go ahead and actually do is slightly different. So we want to say string plus equals. We're going to put a question mark here. Now, each of these query parameters actually has a value and a name. So what we want to look for here is, let's say we have a name equals value, then an and%, then name equals value, and then and over and over. So we want to do this in an intelligent way. So what we can actually do is first create a argument string. And what we're going to do here is we're going to say take these query parameters and compact map them. And compact map is going to basically change them. And what I want to go for here is I want to return a string where we have the $0s.name. So the $0 represents the current element in the iteration, and equals $0.value. And what I want to do is I want to say go ahead and join all of these. We want to join it with a delimiter or a separator here. And the separator I want to join them with is the and symbol. So now that we have this here, we can go ahead and say, let's see, make sure we don't have any issues here. It looks like string interpolation produces an error because it looks like the value here is an optional type. So we're going to want to unwrap it. So what I'll go ahead and do is unwrap it right up here. So I'm going to say guard let value equals $0.value. And now if we don't have a value, we're just going to skip it and return nil in the iteration. That way our error here should go away. And now that we've got this argument string, let's go ahead and actually append this to the end of our string, just like that, plus equals, and then we'll return the string. So hopefully not too complex here. Let me add a docstring comment. So we'll say this is the constructed URL for the API request in string format. Now to actually create a URL from this, we're going to go ahead and say return URL with the string type of URL string. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing. I definitely think we're going to want to split up this video since that took way longer than what I anticipated. Let's actually go ahead and test this out. The way I'm going to test this out is as follows. We're going to jump into one of our view controllers, particularly the character view controller, and let's actually create a request in here. So I'll say a request will be an rm request, and let's actually fill in all of this stuff. So what we want here is an endpoint of characters, and what I'll print out is the request.url. And let's go ahead and give this a build and run in our simulator, which I've got opened up here. And we should see a URL printed out. It is going to yell at me because it is optional. So we do get a appropriate URL. Let me throw this into my browser, make sure there is some JSON there. All right, beautiful. It actually is. Let's try to construct another URL. So what I want to do is maybe I want to include some path components. Maybe I want to stick a 1 at the end. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and give it a run, and we'll come here and take a look what we get printed out. We do in fact get a 1 at the end. So I will take this and toss it here. And it looks like that also works. And let's try finally those query arguments, those query parameters. We have this example here already, so I'm just going to steal this from here. We're going to say for the path components, we don't really care, but we are going to specify some query parameters, which is a URL query item, once again with a name and value. So name here in this case will be name, value will be Rick, and then again this is an array, so we are going to say URL query item, where the name here is going to be, let me see what it was, status, and the value is alive. Make sure that's correct. And let's go ahead and give this a run. Make sure the spit out URL is appropriate. So I'm going to go ahead and take this. It looks correct to me. Let me take this and let me stick it in my browser, and we should get some JSON back, which in fact we do, which is awesome. So now that we've got all this working, let's see where I want to pause this video. So now we definitely have a way to create a request. Let's talk briefly about generics and how we can actually leverage them. So when we create a request, we're going to want to pass it to this RM service, and that part's pretty simple. We're going to pass in an RM request. But what we also want to do is we want to have a appropriate type returned to us here. We want the caller to be able to specify, hey, I want a list all characters response or some other model type, right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to leverage a generic, which will be called T, where T is codable. In other words, whatever T is, it conforms to the codable protocol. And what I will go ahead and do here is we want to be able to specify T. So we're going to say, so let's see why this is yelling at me. So it's saying generic parameter T is not used in function. Yep, because we need to use it. So we're going to say, go ahead and execute this request. We want to be expecting a particular type. So we're going to say expecting type T.type. And the completion is going to return T to us, whatever the T is. In this case, it'll be, whatever type you specify, as the case for the success variant of the parameter. So let me go ahead and put a comma there. It looks like I line broke this at the incorrect spot, so let me fix that as well. And let's see why this is yelling at me. It looks like 1 and a comma. If we compile, everything's looking good. So what do we even do here? And let me actually fix this here to include the additional parameter. So this will be the type of object we expect to get back. So if I jump into my view controller, I want to showcase an example of this, right? So if I jump into the character view controller and we have said, let's see, where did I stick that request? Looks like I deleted it. Yes, in fact, I did delete it. So if I come back into here and I actually say rm_service.shared, since it is a singleton, I want to execute this request. I expect to get back a string from this. And if we look at the completion handler, it'll actually tell us in the result case. So let's go ahead and say result, switch, result. And let's say in the success case, if you look at this, it knows that we're getting a string back. Now, if I go ahead and tweak this and say I expect to get perhaps a RM character back, one of the models we added, if you take a look now at the success case, if you look at the autocomplete, now it knows in the successful API case, we are going to get a character back. So that's the power in a very brief explanation of a generic. Now, I don't want to go too far and deep into the concept of generics, since they can, in fact, get quite complex. But this is the bare bones of how we are going to get a different model back in the success case of an API call. Now, before we wrap up this video, one thing that I do want to talk about is when we create this request, this is not the actual request that we're going to send over the network, right? This is our own custom object. We are going to want to translate this to a URL request, right? A network request. We do have all the components here that we need for that request, which is basically our URL. If we want to pass some data, we can do that as well. One thing I'll include in here is a HTTP method. So what I am going to do here is add another public, what I'll call constant, I guess, instead of a computed property. I'll go ahead and say public let HTTP method. And if I'm not mistaken, all the HTTP methods for the Rick and Morty API are all GET requests. We're just getting some data. We're not deleting or posting or updating anything. So I will include that there. And two last things we're going to do before I wrap up this video, we're going to add some documentation as well as commit and push this. So I'll go ahead and say these are the API constants. And then if we come here, this is the desired endpoint. Here we're going to go ahead and say optional. Well, I'm not going to use the word optional because it's not nullable. So let's go ahead and say these are path components for API, if any. Similar here, these are query arguments for API, if any. And again, I don't want to use the optional terminology here because this is an actual optional, which makes this nullable. This isn't in fact nullable, but it is indeed a kind of figuratively an optional argument, right? We can specify an empty collection, which will yield us the same results. And then finally, we're going to have a few more. We're going to have the computed and constructed API URL. Here we'll have the desired HTTP method. And right now it's hard-coded to get. If we ever wanted to pass it in, we're in good shape to do that. Finally, we'll have construct request. This will be the target endpoint. This here will be the collection of path components. And then this one here will be a collection of query parameters. Now, one optimization we're going to actually make here is instead of having a collection of strings, because we don't want the user to specify the same path component over and over, as far as I'm aware at the moment, we're going to actually make this a set of strings. That way, each string does in fact need to be unique, and we're not going to run into any issues of specifying the same exact path component over and over. Now, if we do come across a case where it is something along the lines of, character/1/info/1, in that case, we have 2 repeating path components. We'll adjust this as needed. So that's basically, I think, where we should wrap up this video. Let's go ahead and jump into terminal. I'm once again going to CD into my project folder here, and I'll go ahead and stage this. I'm going to commit and say create API request, and I will go ahead and say git push, and that will wrap up hopefully this particular video. And it is insanely windy out, and it continues to be super annoying while I record this video. Let me go ahead and see if I staged it. Looks like I had a typo somewhere in here, so we're gonna say git add. Let me go ahead and spell add correctly, commit and push. Looks like my commit had a typo as well, fix that as well. Bear with me here while the wind continues to distract me. And we'll go ahead and push, and we'll wrap it up. In the next video, we'll take a look at the service actually sending a request. We'll see how far we get. But thanks again for watching. If you stuck around through all the windy noisiness, I will see you in the next one.